like to welcome back the crowds. Thank you for coming back. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Chandra Ward. Professor Ward is a native of Albany, Georgia, as well as Cobb County, Georgia. A graduate of the University of Georgia, Ms. Ward went on to Texas to work for social justice organizations such as ACORN, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, where she organized low-income neighborhoods in Dallas, Texas, and registered people to vote. She was later involved in many other social justice organizations in Austin, Texas, where she volunteered her time marching and lobbying for justice. Chandra and I met in Austin, Texas, where we were both enrolled in the graduate sociology program at Texas State University, San Marcos. In keeping in line with today's theme, Voices of the Voiceless, Chandra always brought perspectives of marginalized groups to the center. Chandra used her own voice to ensure that others would not be voiceless. Her master's thesis looked at Afrocentric explanations for differing drinking patterns between Black and white college students. She is currently a doctoral candidate at Georgia State University, where she is working on her dissertation, looking at the relocation experiences of former public housing residents in Atlanta. She is also a professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Kennesaw State University. She is the author of a recently published sociology textbook, Voices from the Margins, Fresh Perspectives on an Introduction to Sociology. Professor Ward's research interests include communities, urban sociology, visual sociology, and intersections of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Professor Ward and her family have a long, rich history with Albany State University. As Chandra explains, I grew up on ASU's campus. We are lucky to hear her voice today. And without further delay, I would like to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Professor Chandra Ward.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Albany State University and the Gender Studies Symposium for having me come as keynote speaker this week. I really appreciate it. I'm very thankful. As Dr. Dean mentioned, ASU has educated and graduated multiple generations of women in my family. Some of them are here today. I would like to begin with acknowledging the women in my family who are here and are graduates of Albany State University. First, Mrs. Barbara Ward Carroll, my eldest aunt, was Albany State University's first Miss Kappa, as well as having 34 years of service at ASU in the Dean's office, in addition to the James Pendergrass Memorial Library. My middle aunt, Reverend Dr. Gloria Ward Wright, was Albany State University's Miss Junior in 1966. My youngest aunt, Miss Ella Jean Ward, along with her daughter, Miss Alicia Ward, are both proud graduates of Albany State University. And finally, Albany State University acknowledged the passing of the late Ms. Gladys Ward Sapp, the cousin of my grandfather. As many of you may know, she was the author of the Albany State University's alma mater. So Albany State has been a significant institution in my family, especially the women in my family. And as a child growing up here in Albany, I recall trailing behind one of my oldest cousins, Eric, when he was attending school here, as he walked me along this campus over 30 years ago. And I never could have imagined publishing a book, returning to ASU as a keynote speaker. This past year has truly been a dream. The book I published earlier that Dr. Dean spoke about is titled Voices from the Margins, A Fresh Perspective on Sociology. The inspiration for this title is from the classic book Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center by Black feminist writer, scholar, and activist Bell Hooks. Now, one of the main points Hooks makes in this book is to recognize feminism as a movement to end sexist oppression, thereby directing our attention to systems of domination and the interrelatedness of sex, race, and class oppression. Okay, she also saw feminism as defined in such a way that it calls attention, or it should call attention to the diversity of women's social and political reality. centralizing the experiences of all women, especially the women whose social conditions have been least written about, studied, or changed by political movements. And this inspired a way of thinking by many Black feminists who have contributed to intersectional thought, such as Sojourner Truth's groundbreaking speech to an audience of white abolitionist women in 1851. She came up with the speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" to draw the attention that the category of woman is not a singular monolithic category, but it is a category that includes Black women who, as opposed to their white female counterparts at the time, were thought of as delicate and should be removed or contained within the domestic domain. This did not apply to Sojourner Truth and many other Black women at this time who were brought here specifically to work and breed. So from Sojourner Truth to legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, I've been inspired, and other Black women have been inspired to think about the intersections and the multiplicities of women's subjectivities and experiences. I saw the opportunity to create an introductory college textbook on sociology, normally replete with homages to privileged dead white men, and instead flip the script by kind of kneading the dough of sociology. And how do you knead dough? Okay, you usually, and I'm not an expert baker, I've baked a couple of things, not perfectly, but you typically knead the dough by pushing the dough from the margins into the center and integrating it into the center over and over again. And since I was young, I've always had an interest in those of us on the margins of society, those not at the top of the social hierarchy, but those on the margins of society, which is why I'm a billionaire today. Thank you. It's been great. That's how you become a billionaire, is by focusing on people on the margins. I'm just kidding. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, but it is a worthy cause that brings you riches inside. And though these thinkers inspired my desire to center the multiple experiences of marginalized women in my own writing, teaching, and research, I felt the call to social justice and to amplify marginalized experiences early on in my life. Back in high school, my best friend and I had a vision for our lives. We wanted to, quote, give back to the people. We'd always joke about that. What do you want to do, Heather? Let's give back to the people, whatever that meant. We didn't have a definition, but we kind of knew in our minds what that meant to one another. My best friend was a white girl from a lower class family, working class family, and I was just a poor Black girl. We saw the effects of class inequality as we went to the worst school in one of the best school districts in Metro Atlanta, if not Georgia at the time. In what was even then an economically depressed area, I hear from my students at Kennesaw that the school that I went to is even worse now. It's really fascinating when I tell my students where I went to school, where I went to high school, I get oohs and ahs from the audience about the high school that I went to, and it really gives me a sense of street cred that I've never had, actually. I'm like, yeah, that's right, I'm from the streets of Marietta, Cobb County. Don't mess with me. But my best friend and I saw in a county of privilege that we were obscured from that privilege. We were obscured from what people thought of when they thought of Cobb County, when they thought of Marietta. And when I went off to the University of Georgia, this privilege, or my lack of privilege, was even more pronounced when people would approach me knowing that I was from Cobb County. They asked me if I was an East Cobb snob. And I would tell them that I was actually from the other side of the tracks of Cobb County. Honestly, a Cobb County most people within and outside the county scarcely know exists. I was one of 4 people from my high school class who went to the University of Georgia. I was the only African American, while oftentimes the East Cobb high schools and other schools in the county had up to 90% of their senior class attending Georgia. Initially, I was not very active in social justice work in the University of Georgia. I had practiced a lot of things having to do with the social life that the University of Georgia is known for. When I was at the University of Georgia, I worked at the main library and would come across books from those who inspired me, such as Congressman John Lewis and the author who is also from Georgia, Alice Walker. And one spring break while camping out on the beach during my last year at the University of Georgia, I took with me Alice Walker's book, Anything We Love Can Be Saved. This is one of her few, if only, nonfiction books. And this book discusses her participation in the civil rights movement and the feminist movement and her lifelong love and dedication to social justice. I was really inspired by that book. It took what my best friend and I talked about in sort of a vague way of giving back to the people and really kind of helped crystallize what I wanted to do with my life and my own mind. It touched me and spoke to me, to my deeply held values that only up until that time transpired in conversations and personal thoughts. It was at that moment after reading her book on the beach during my spring break alone that I knew I wanted to turn my thoughts into action. And I knew at that point that I wanted to be an activist. Again, if you want to be a billionaire, that is the road that you take in your life. So how do we turn theory into action? After I'd read this Alice Walker book, I interviewed with the community activist organization called ACORN, which stands for the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. This organization was the largest community organization of low to moderate income families in this country until they were taken down by right-wing conservatives around 2008. This was, again, they got taken down with a lot of controversial claims about voter fraud and other things. Again, this was around the 2008 election, the same election that threatened to put the first black president in the White House. I'm not saying that they're related or anything, I'm just saying, and I just want to keep it 100. I'm just saying. These two things coincided. You make up your minds for yourselves. The powers that be were so afraid of the low-income and Black Latino folks organizing, registering to vote, which is a key part of what ACORN did. So this seemed right up my alley. I started working as a community organizer in the fall of 2000. This job took me out to Dallas, Texas, which is halfway across the country. This would signal the beginning of me making good on that talk that I had with my best friend in high school, that promise of wanting to give back to the people. It was here that I cut my teeth on grassroots organizing. This was a strange city in which I knew no one. I kept the description of my job to my family I kept it very vague. I would talk to my grandmother on the phone and just tell her that I was working for social justice organization, because if she really knew what I was doing, working 6 days a week, long hours, walking up and down working class neighborhoods day and night in Dallas, Texas, inviting myself into the homes of strangers, talking to them about how to join a grassroots effort driven by activism, she would have fell out. Okay, that's the term that she would have used. She would have just fell out. However, it was worth the secrecy. It was worth the vagaries, because I'm proud to say that President Obama and I once shared the same job title as community organizer. The community that I was assigned to organize out in Texas was called the Juanita Craft neighborhood. This was a group of about 5 elderly women who were equipped with hover rounds and rascal motorized wheelchairs and canes, but they showed up to every meeting. They were the most committed, some of the most committed people I've ever worked with. They had a fire about stamping out prostitutes, drug dealers, telling the city of Dallas to pay attention to their neighborhood because their tax dollars were just as good as the tax dollars of Highland Park, which is a very rich area of Dallas. These elderly Black women, some disabled, all on fixed incomes, they were some of the most dedicated people I've ever worked with. My passion for social justice and fate would eventually lead me to Austin, Texas, where I continued grassroots organizing. I wrote for a local homeless newspaper. Again, I'm not sure that my family knew that I was hanging out with homeless men in Austin in my spare time, but it was a great experience contributing articles to the Austin Homeless Advocate, which was the name of the homeless newspaper. This was just one of many platforms for both the housing secure and insecure population. This was just one of many platforms where society's forgotten and their allies were able to work together to amplify otherwise muted voices, to help them tell their own story directly and not from someone telling a story about them and how they are a problem. But you actually got to hear from the perspective, read the writings of actually homeless people and what was on their minds and what was important to them. My time out in Texas also briefly took me to Tulia, Texas, which is a small town in the panhandle of Texas, situated between Lubbock and Amarillo. I participated in a freedom ride to engage in acts of solidarity with the community and families directed by the erroneous drug charges brought on the community by a criminal police officer, which resulted in significant percentage of the town's Black population being arrested on these drug charges, as well as prison sentences up to 99 years. This was a highly publicized event in Tulia, Texas. There were a lot of people, it got a lot of media attention. 2020 had aired something about it, 60 Minutes, but this was basically a situation that just happened to get national attention, but happens, unfortunately, in many small towns across the U.S. where race and the drug war clash heads and result in the over-imprisonment and the wrongful imprisonment of oftentimes poor African Americans. I returned back to Georgia, and after being active in the social justice movement, I wanted to try and bring action into academia. The title of my talk actually is Amplifying the Voices of Others Through a Black Feminist Praxis. Now, I've discussed and mentioned several Black feminists who have inspired my thinking. And praxis, the word praxis means theory and action. How do we bring theory and action? These theories about amplifying the voices of others, how do we actually put that into action? So I did that initially through social justice organizing, but coming back into the world of academia, that, again, like I said, is, most textbooks are filled with homages to canonical thinkers of any given discipline, which typically end up being white. For the discipline that I'm in, sociology, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the first Black sociologist and the co-creator of the NAACP, he was only included in our textbooks in the past 10 years. And he was the first sociologist to talk about race, and not that race what has not been important, but because of his position, because of who he was the only person to think about race as a sociologist compared to Karl Marx or Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, other very highly heralded and decorated theorists in the discipline of sociology. Graduate school really reconnected me with these theories from bell hooks to Patricia Hill Collins, put forth by Black feminists. And today, a Black feminist intersectional praxis drives my academic endeavors. I carry these experiences into the classroom and out in the field of conducting research and in the production of knowledge. While I've been at Georgia State University, where I currently am pursuing my doctorate, I've had the opportunity to participate in research documenting the experiences of former Atlanta public housing residents. Basically, if you're not aware of this, Atlanta public housing, all of it has been demolished except for one building that has been reserved for disabled and older residents. However, as a project of urban renewal, all of the public housing has been demolished. And so a team of researchers, including myself, had the opportunity to interview people who had to be relocated into Section 8 housing. So over a course of 2 years, we interviewed people about their experiences, followed them everywhere they moved, everywhere they went, to document their experiences. Now, much of the academic literature and policy literature on housing policy centers around the concentration of poverty and racial segregation that public housing is considered to perpetuate. What's missing from this literature is the intersection of, not the intersection of race and class, but the importance of race, class, and gender in this population. When we reduce people down to a single analytical category of Black or poor or gay or straight, we render other power structures that construct one's identity and life experiences invisible. Public housing relocations disproportionately affect poor Black women. Okay, that is the demographic of most of our respondents in public housing in Atlanta, poor Black women. However, again, the literature in academia, policy that informs politicians about how to deal with housing in the United States only looks at the racial and class component. How can this be when the overwhelming majority of public housing heads of household in Atlanta are poor Black women with children? How can policy be improved by looking at the intersections of these experiences? Some of what I know from my own research is the importance of informal networks, particularly for women with children. Okay, public housing, what a lot of people do not know, because they have not talked to people in public housing, they've only imposed their own middle-class values and assumptions onto this group, is that though public housing, rife with social problems, provided a very strong informal network for women with children in particular, and the elderly. If someone needed to borrow a car, they knew someone in their neighborhood who would allow them to go and borrow their car. If they needed someone to keep their children while they held down a job, they knew someone in their neighborhood would be able to fill that need. Okay, the importance is that they knew each other. A lot of people that I've interviewed in public housing, they are happy with their new amenities, but something that I think most people do not expect is that they repeatedly say, I miss the community. They miss that dearly. They miss the tight network, the thing that sort of perhaps bonds them is that they are in this experience together, and they rely on one another in lieu of having a wealth of financial resources. Their resources do not lie in material wealth, but their resources lie rather in their dependence on one another. So kinship and networks that are eroded or outright severed when forced to relocate to other neighborhoods. So when you're simply looking at concentration of poverty and racial segregation in your analysis, the importance of childcare to these women, to these communities, to safety, okay, and being able to borrow a car instead of having to wait on a bus or walk somewhere in a neighborhood in which you're unfamiliar and around people whom you do not know, okay, because that was another component. People, we think of public housing as dangerous, and not to say that it is not, but what we heard from these women also was that there were people that would look out for them, you know, the old women, the elderly women, they were usually are the loneliest people in our sample. They miss public housing the most because they've been there for a very long time, and they had a position in that little society. They were somebody. Transplanted into a random apartment complex in Atlanta where they know no one, they are no one, okay? And Miss Cookie or Miss whomever, they would be outside watching. They knew everybody's business, if you will, but that had a positive effect in producing their own community knowledge. And that's part of what is missing when you do not include these multiple identities in your research, when you do not research these folks using their own voices, but rather impose your own perspectives on what their lives might be like, what their lives should be like. You're missing their own voices and what worked for them and what did not work for them and what they actually need. So the importance, again, of things such as childcare and safety that specifically or disproportionately affect women with children are missing from the story, and it silences their experiences. It silences people who are already silenced in our society. So my call to social justice reminds me actually of my aunt in the audience, Dr. Reverend Gloria Wright's journey as she was a young girl here in Albany during the Albany movement, if you guys are aware of the Albany movement during the civil rights movement, where she documents in her book, From the Back of the Line. My social justice experience reminds me a bit of that. Her book, From the Back of the Line, and her titling it that, really reminds me a lot of the title of my book, Voices from the Margin, what that's getting at. We have exposure to the narratives of those in the front of the line, okay? But what about those in the middle and the back of the line? The women that held that line, the gay folks that held that line. With my book that I got out, published earlier this year, Voices from the Margins. My goal is to centralize the experiences of as many oppressed folks as possible and highlighting the complexities of their identities in relation to multiple sites of privilege. It centralizes the experiences, again, of those often not thought about, the disabled, the queer people of color, the Latinos and immigrants in immigrant neighborhoods. And in having a viewpoint, an intersectional Black feminist viewpoint, bell hooks believed that would centralize the experiences of all women, especially the women whose social conditions have been least written about, studied, or changed by political movements. Intersectionality forms the basis of my sociological inquiry, both inside and outside the classroom. This perspective makes visible, again, the multiple, oftentimes marginalized standpoints, as well as the complexity of our social world. Our social world is not just Black or white, gay or straight, and able-bodied, but it is a intersecting mosaic of experiences. An intersectional perspective is an inclusive one that can best inform students about a diverse world, while acknowledging and legitimizing the complexity of their lives. So I have great pleasure in being an instructor at Kennesaw State University, where it is certainly not as monolithic demographically as the University of Georgia, but I have a lot of students who have not been exposed to very much, a lot of students from North Georgia mountains. Eerily enough, last semester, even teaching race ethnicity, I came to find out that I teach students who have Klansmen in their family and have been taught a certain way of looking at the world. And so it is my pleasure to come out with a book where, don't worry, you will get your, standard classical white privileged male theorists, but for the most part, you'll be flipping through the book and reading about multiple Black lesbian identities. You'll be reading excerpts from Black feminist thought by Patricia Hill Collins. You'll be reading about the experiences of women who are disabled in dating and how people perceive them. They will be reading things and experiences from those that they've had the privilege to ignore. And that is what is missing from a lot of college textbooks and curricula, is that too often voices that are not given a voice can quickly and easily be pushed to the back of the book, can be a footnote, a side note. If we have enough time in the semester, perhaps we'll cover it. If not, it's not really that important anyway. All of our experiences are important. And that's what I hope to emphasize in my book. So again, it's important that we use our positions of privilege, mine being education, to help amplify the voices that would otherwise be invisible and silent, because we live in a world of where we usually just privilege one particular identity, again, Black, woman, disabled, over all others. However, they work together. Sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia, they all work together in order to maintain power and dominance while holding everyone else to the margins. Okay, again, these kids that I teach, they have the privilege of not having to know anything outside of their own world. So whether in the streets, organizing, or within the walls of academia, it's important that we not only tell our stories, but the stories of those whose stories would not otherwise get told. Otherwise, we will allow or perpetuate people to get degrees and continue to live in ignorance, where college should be a time in which we experience a lot of experience through meeting other folks, but also in learning both about ourselves and those not like ourselves. So again, it's important that we not only tell our stories, but the stories of those whose stories may otherwise not get told. We must use our own privilege as educated folks to amplify the voices of others, both outside and within the walls of academia. Otherwise, we risk maintaining the power structures that obscures and silences. And I choose to not be a part of that. Again, thank you, Dr. Amber Dean, for inviting me to be keynote speaker here at Albany State. Thank you to others on the committee, the Gender Studies Committee, for inviting me to come and speak. It has been an absolute honor, and I thank all of you. I know I cut short. I don't know if anyone has any questions about my book, about teaching, about social justice activism. If you do, we have some time to spare, so. Or is everybody just ready to go on spring break?
Hi, first of all, thank you for coming and being our
Thank you.
speaker. When you're talking specifically about the issue of privilege, how do you best engage your students to recognize whatever semblance of privilege that they may have? Because oftentimes people feel as if you're blaming me for something, as opposed to letting them know that they need to learn to perceive things a little bit more differently.
That's a great question, and that is very challenging, as it sounds like I had, people can be very defensive about acknowledging their privilege. They can shut down, and everyone is different. It depends on where each student comes in at. I had the pleasure and the challenge of teaching race and ethnicity last semester at Kennesaw, and I taught it before, but I had two very different classes. Again, this class that I had some white male students in particular, who were very obstinate to the idea that, well, any of the ideas, actually. So, and I had the challenge of trying to get my point across, to not, excuse the pun, whitewash it, while at the same time not shutting down folks who may already be quite ready to shut down at any moment's notice. So I did not get through to everyone, but I think at least one of the students who, specifically when I referenced, had a relative who was a Klan member, I think we got to him by the very last day. But getting students to recognize their own privilege is challenging. There are exercises that are out there. When I talk about things such as white privilege or male privilege or heterosexual privilege, it's important to identify that which is invisible to them, because privilege is invisible. So bringing light to making that invisible thing visible to them by looking at the flip side of what they do not have to think about. These are things that you do not have to think about when you think about perhaps narratives of what you've gained in this country through a pull yourself up by the bootstraps individualist narrative. What you're not thinking about and taking into consideration are the many government policies that were restricted access, groups access to things such as home loans, to being able to live in certain neighborhoods that cost groups, certain racial groups, billions. If you are male, here are things that you do not have to think about, per se, that a woman would have to think about and go through their daily life thinking about, and so on and so forth. So that's definitely a challenge in the classroom, getting people to recognize their privilege. It depends on the individual student, but also, and students do get very defensive about it, but also without being particularly combative. At least that's not my style. I feel like honey, bringing bees to honey is more my approach. Just simply showing them what they cannot see, what they do not see, which is their privilege, and things that they do not have to think about. So hopefully, I don't have a hard and fast perfect answer, and I apologize for that. I wish I did. That's just a complicated issue that we face in teaching, but not only teaching, in our interactions with people in the world, that need to be exposed to and aware of their own privileges in order to make some type of social change. So that's all I have.
Can I share the mic with you?
Yeah.
On behalf of Albany State's Gender Studies Committee, we would like to extend this gift to you in gratitude for being our keynote speaker today.
Thank you so much. And again, this has been a pleasure and an honor. I did not officially attend Albany State University, but I've been here as a kid, again, following around one of my oldest cousins, Eric, and his wife, now wife, Crystal, who he met here on campus. That's romantic. Maybe you can meet your life partner here too. And learning how to read from the books at Albany State Library that I would get from my auntie. I literally, this place has been foundational to my upbringing and has produced brilliant women in my family and no doubt in other families. So this has been just such a privilege and an honor, and I thank you all for attending, and I hope that you were able to glean something from my message. If you have any inkling for telling your stories, to putting your stories out there, to putting stories that you may know about of other people who are normally silent, whose experiences we don't normally hear about, I hope that perhaps you can take something from this in marking your own path and starting your own path to, again, richness and wealth, lifestyles rich and famous, by helping, by amplifying the voices of those who are marginalized. And there are a lot of stories to tell here in Albany, so thank you so much again.